Ready? Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, both online and in the room. Welcome to the CFE Seminar today, and I'm really happy to introduce you all to Caroline. Caroline is a postdoc who is, hello Caroline, who's joined SP2, or the Enfranchising Enterprise program that we've been hosting here at the Center for Future Enterprise. And her talk here is actually going to present one of the key pillars of the program. I won't talk too much about the presentation and take the thunder out of what Caroline is going to present today, but the talk is around what's the role of the resource sector in trying to understand and engage different stakeholders in a balanced perspective. In terms of introducing Caroline, like I said, she started her role as a postdoc here in January this year. So 2022 January, even though we've had conversations, some challenges delayed our start. And Caroline has a very interesting boundary spanning background. I just learned, we had some chats earlier about her legal career that she had before she became a senior researcher in the Hunter Valley Foundation, and where she's worked for 10 years in regional development, another area that's very close to the SP2 in terms of bringing equality resources to regional Australia and others. So that's a bit of an introduction about Caroline, and I'd like to ask you to all join me to warmly welcome her to this talk. Those of you who are online, please feel free to put any questions you have on chat. And after the presentation, we'll take questions both in the face-to-face room and in the online forum. Thank you very much, and over to you, Caroline.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I think I know nearly all the faces in the room now, which is nice, and hello to everybody online. So I'm Caroline. I joined the SP2 Signature Project 2 in January, and it's all about how can we give people a voice, and how can we make sure that people aren't left behind in our society. So that's been a really interesting topic, and I'm working with Wasana, Artemis, Kevin is the mentor for the team, Alexandra has also been involved in the team, which has been lovely, and there's a broader team also whom I haven't necessarily been working that closely with at this point. So that's been wonderful. Now, in terms of the resource sector, I come from, before I moved to Northern New South Wales, where I still have my main home, I lived in Newcastle for 15 years. So I travelled through the Hunter Valley on a really regular basis, and it's an awe-inspiring landscape. It's hard to describe how mountains have been created and dug up out of the earth, and it actually defines a very hundreds of acres. So you can see that it's a really significant issue. The way that it's affected local community has been very significant, and yet it's also breathed life into Newcastle, which is now becoming a more diverse economy, but it's been the backbone, and before that BHP steelworks, when we were still evaluating in Australia. So this is about how much is not enough, which I am pretty attached to as a title. There was how much is too much prior to this one, so there have been a few iterations, but the reason that it's called that is because so many companies are trying to respond to stakeholders, trying to do the right thing, but it's becoming more difficult to really satisfy those demands because they are so extensive now. And we have to go beyond just saying, oh yes, we'll do this because we have to. Increasingly, NGOs and different stakeholders are saying, we want some genuine engagement. So often much isn't enough because the standards that are now being asked of companies, and the need to move towards genuine engagement rather than superficial engagement.
Sorry to interrupt, but the slides are not on slide share, so we can only see the first slide.
We are still on the first slide.
Yeah, you're still on the first slide. I've just been talking and talking and talking.
Oh, that's okay. It just doesn't look like you're sharing. You've got slideshow on. Sorry.
I'm sharing in audio at this stage, and now I'll try and click to the next one. But I'm not finding what it's doing. Okay, so I probably should have done this before I started talking a lot, and that is I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we now stand upon, and pay respects to the elders past and present, and their customs, laws, and creation spirits. So today, sorry, I'll be doing this a bit, I think. Would you like me to use the computer instead, perhaps, Anissa, to click them through? Time check, Kevin.
If you just use the computer.
Yeah, I think we just use the computer. So I can do that. I can work.
Oh, this happened with other races.
Well, Anissa's sorting that out. I can just continue talking if you like. That's probably a good idea. So today, I'm trying to follow the normal process that we do. This is despite my presentational attitude, born from years of presenting in front of large audiences, please forgive me, but you're invited to interject anytime at all. And the first thing that I'll be doing is introducing our research and taking you through that as coherently as I can, because it's full of pillars, rungs, and stages. So I'll be trying to help you understand that research. And then just going on to have a look at, okay, how does this relate to practitioners in the resources sector, their advisors, all of those people, CEOs, board members. You know, this has got relevance, hopefully, for quite a few people in the sector and even beyond the sector. And then also looking at the directions for future research, which are very emergent at the moment. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about was the fact that there is now this requirement to respond to a real diversity of stakeholder demands. Whether you're taking a deontological approach, I must do this because it's my duty to do so, a utilitarian approach, I want to add value to the society, you know, whether it's just instrumentalism, I can do this because it's good business sense, you know, or pragmatism, I have to do this because otherwise I can't do the mining. You know, there are a whole lot of reasons people do it or mining companies do it. And Octetti was a watershed case because Octetti took place in 1994 to 96. It was a big court dispute. And the outcome of that was a settlement, which was considered to be the first David against Goliath moment. And NGOs and a whole lot of different stakeholders thought, okay, we now have a say, we're talking to the media, we've got a new set of tools to make some demands. And it's been building momentum ever since. It was prior to that as well, but it's considered a watershed. And the reason it's so difficult is because there are balancing act needs to be fulfilled. It's not just a matter of like a government saying my constituents want this, therefore I will try and give it to them. It's about I'm here to create profit for shareholders. How do I balance it with all these other things? So the context, and it would be, can we just flick through to the context slides? Next one. Yeah, I think the visuals on this, if we can just stick with the visuals on that one for a second, are really important because I just wanted to get across the hugeness of the issues that we're dealing with. And this is mining. This was one statement that really hit me. Mining disassembles the life of locals. You know, what does that tell you about how difficult it is to balance those tensions when you've got such huge things at stake. And then the next one was a mining disaster in Turkey. 301 people died because they compromised on all the safety standards. And then we have the next slide here, which is the Hunter Valley. There is that landscape. That is what the landscape looks like. And it used to be agricultural. And there are tensions and there are horse studs there. There's a whole diverse economy, which this is affecting. Whole townships have been wiped out. So it's a massive issue. And then we go on to look at the next one, which is a picture of the Amazon. And look at those lines. They're roads. They're rivers. Their biodiversity, their indigenous cultures where they live. And it is being almost, very affected by the mining industry. And it's not to say it's all bad, but there's certainly a massive impact there. So looking at our research, the problem is that a lot of the approaches are now still considered to be reactive, superficial, don't really do much in terms of really long-term enduring value. So it's about how to create that. There's a whole lot of frameworks about how to do it, how to make sure that it fits in with your business model, all of that sort of thing. Is it in the core of your business? Is it in the periphery of your business? That's not what this is about. It's not about business models and that sort of thing. It hopefully will be as we progress, but at the moment it's just about looking at the literature and working out how can private enterprise actually make a difference in a real genuine, enduring way. So that's the question that we looked at. It's in a crowded field. There are whole industries. There's huge literatures about this. And so we're working in that space. The objective was to do that, to describe and analyse those things that enable companies to, thank you very much, to respond to stakeholders and then translate that importantly into a sense-making device. So that practical application. And to do that, we had to adapt a conceptual framework. We didn't have to, but we chose to adopt a conceptual framework that was actually developed in a public policy environment. And so that was an interesting exercise, but a lot of the same issues were at play in terms of who has power, who doesn't, who gets what. So that's the method that we took to the project. Okay, and let's see, can I, oh no, we'll stay, sorry. Yep, the objective and the method. So we need to go on to the next slide. Okay, and so new perspectives are important. So we'll just go, so we need new perspectives, in other words. So there's a huge literature, a huge industry, but amongst all of that, there's still a lack of real crystallization of what's going to make a difference. And that's what we were trying to get to. And this is Arnstein. She wrote an article in 1969, which is still relevant today, about participatory decision-making and how that can be used to shift the balance of power, and how it often doesn't, because it's usually tokenism. She calls about degrees of conflict, tokenism, and then citizen power. So it was a great framework to look at the same sort of issues in the mining sector. And that's her central proposition. You get more power, you get more participation, and you have access to a fairer share. That's not always the case. It's not as clear cut as that. But that's the starting point of the model. And then we go on. How are we going there? Okay. Okay, now we had to adapt that model. And to do that, we had to look at, okay, so what is the literature saying about that? And in order to work out what literature we were looking at, we had to think about, okay, what are the main terms here? And these were the main terms. CSR. There's a lot of definitions of CSR out there. A lot of them say, oh, it's beyond the law. But what does the law say in a lot of countries? Virtually nothing, you know, in a lot of developing countries. So we chose to take the view that it's more about the differences and the legitimate stakeholders who are affected by a mining operation. So it's about looking after their interests, and SLO is when you look after their interests and you're able then to get access to resources, and you have the permission of the community to operate, social license to operate. And then stakeholder engagement, which is another way of looking at participation, but in a corporate context, is another key term which define the literature. Okay, so that's where we started, and we have Arnstein's model, we have the basic terms, we have the basic literature, and then we start the process of adaptation. And to do that, we took a model. Arnstein has one pillar, and that's about participation, engagement. We felt that really, in an organisational sense, a lot of decisions about what happens aren't about engagement. They're about managerial prerogative and what your operations look like. So we had another pillar to say these are two things that are going to affect how we respond to stakeholders. And we explained the rationale for adding pillar 2, that they were separate. They work together, but they're separate. And then we described the rungs, because Arnstein has, as I said, a series of, it's a ladder. You go up from conflict right to the very top of citizen power. And then we used examples to explain the rungs. So we took those out of the literature. So that was the process of adapting the ladder. And there we are, there's the ladder. Okay, conflict, social license to operate, systemic change, and then those levels. There were ample examples in the literature to help us understand what was happening on each of those levels. And that then can help companies to reflect on what they're doing. So the operational approaches at each level that were typical of it, that suggested what their underlying character was, what the attitude was that underlay them. And so, you know, you get that guns out, collude with the state, we're going to push through, down at the bottom, manipulation. Even a lot of companies today, climate change isn't happening. Oh yeah, it is happening, but everybody else is, you know, digging stuff up. You know, those sort of discourses, manipulation therapy, changing the discourse, informing one-way communication, consultation going up, more two-way, vocation actually embedding stuff into strategic perspectives along both levels, the participation and the operational approaches. Now, systemic change, gee, didn't see a lot of that, but we more or less defined that as the stage that you can take to get up to where you really do create this genuine, enduring change. So that's what we were looking at in terms of trying to get a real sense of what is it that can create real change for different types of stakeholders. So that was the research. And then we go on to look at, okay, that's the basic tool. Now let's convert this into a sense-making device that organisations can use. On one ladder, on one axis, we have power through participation, and on the other, we have operational approaches, those two pillars. And then the diagonal line is where you go up along those two pillars in a coordinated fashion, with the idea that that is increasing the benefits for different types of stakeholders. So that's the, you know, proceeding up that line in alignment might be considered the ideal, but for different stakeholders, it's going to look different. And you just have to go through a process where you're looking at that in relation to your different stakeholder groups. It's not always necessary or possible to be at the top in relation to every stakeholder group. So that's the sort of thing that companies need to have a look at when they're considering their CSR activities. And the way that that ladder is adapted will be a creative process for every organisation that will actually add value in itself. When you have the dots on either side of that line, if you're wondering, that's when you're not in alignment. But once again, that can be a justified approach because you empower purely through engaging with people, and you don't necessarily always have to translate that into activity. And the other way around, sometimes you have activity and you've done it because you've got to report on your emissions or whatever, you know, and you haven't engaged about that. So there isn't always alignment, and it's a question of looking at that and determining whether that is the best you can do, and whether you can do more. So this then goes on to that device is a reflection, learning and strategy development. And now we go through what you do if you're a business using that ladder. You could use it in relation to each stakeholder group, as I said, or you could use it and then aggregate it to have a look at your overall CSR portfolio to see whether or not, what types of, we call it value creation, social, economic, and environmental, see what kinds of value you're creating. And so the reflection part is looking at forensics. Where are we on the ladder? This is the inside out bit. So real reflection on where the company comes in. You've got your identity and your fingerprints all over it. You're looking at, this has got a lot of words and you don't have to read them all. But these are the things that you might look at. What are our relationships like? Why are they like? That issue of trust. You know, how are we approaching that? Are we embedding things across a value chain, or are they just peripheral? You know, are we embedding, you know, the way people work and understanding that there are cultural differences? Are we embedding that into the value chain? Structural issues, what does our organisation look like and how is that affecting our CSR? How are motivations, context? You know, in so many situations, you could only do so much, especially where the state wasn't doing much. And so you kind of had to come in as a mining company and almost be the government, you know, and that led to a lot of situations where stakeholders were disenfranchised because nobody was standing up for their rights. The company didn't really need to or want to, and the state wasn't watching their populations back or their environment. So there are all those issues about context, you know, so starting to reflect about those. If you're a mining company in Brazil, you'd probably be looking at very different things to what a mining company in Australia would be looking at. But this is the process, the creative process of understanding what you're doing. And then you go on to learn. And Anna, all thanks to you, we have a whole lot of, there we go, paradoxes. Do we compromise or do we collaborate? What does it actually look like? Trade-off or synergy? And so when we're looking at these things, let's have a look at them. Okay, so are we looking at being agile and ambidextrous, or are we relying on the fact that we're an incumbent? You know, and how does that affect what we're doing? How can we change that? You know, so many mining companies are perhaps sitting on their laurels a little bit in terms of maybe value adding, looking at other energy markets, that sort of thing. What does your decision making look like? Are you taking into account the local and the global? And how does that interchange look like? Can we change it? You know, are our local populations feeling left out because we're so busy focusing on emissions, we're not really talking about their needs? You know, so there's always some tensions there, and that short-term, long-term is probably what underlies most issues in this realm. Because if we're looking at short-term, we offer a swimming pool, and if we're long-term, we're looking at how do we really create a community based on what we do and the wealth that we bring to the community. So that's probably, if I had to say, a dividing line between going the social license stage, which is the middle stage, up to the systemic stage. That would probably be the underlying thing that determines that positioning. And then going on to strategy development. Can you just flick me through there for a second on this? Thank you. Yeah, so once again, do we reconsider our temporal dimension? and look at, okay, what are we doing with innovation? You know, are we co-creating innovations? What about this new manufacturing industry that we're supposed to be, you know, building in this country? You know, have we started that virtuous circle of working in our communities, trying to create this new manufacturing industry based on what we do? And then I'm a transition scholar, which means that you're looking at how you transition to different landscapes and to different regimes. So new technology, the renewables, if you like, now are becoming a regime, and that will gradually move into something that's the norm, the landscape, the way we do stuff. Where are we positioned? Are we part of these niches? You know, let's start developing a strategy that takes us into these new places. So that's another thing that is really going to affect how we interact with stakeholders, how we see that. Okay, and some of the questions there are focusing on synergies. Okay, can that help us to improve our triple bottom line? What does our innovation system look like? I think the innovation system is the biggie. Our connections with other businesses, our connection with research institutions, our connections with the government and the policy frameworks. That's a big thing to look at. Okay, this is an area where we can improve our strategy, because there often is this virtuous circle of innovation and CSR. And there also has to be CSR fit. So when you're doing strategies, you can't say, okay, we're going to go into regenerative agriculture when you know nothing about it. So that's not naturally going to be a good place to go. So there are a few of the things that you can look at with strategy development. And going to the last part of what I wanted to talk about today was the fact that there were many limitations in that research. There were some big concepts we were talking about, but that does create ongoing opportunities. So I'm introducing the tree. And sorry, here we go. We want to understand and describe the factors that enable and drive ascension of the ladder. Essentially, that's what we want to do in our next stage. And we want to assist companies to do this. Okay, so that's the next research question, if you like. How do we take this to the next level? And that would define it. We looked at, when we did the article, my apologies, we looked at mechanisms, we look at motivations, we said a whole lot of things. This needs to be explored, but when it comes down to it, that's what we're looking at, that research question. And I'm going to call this Wasana's tree. Because we sat down together and had a brief discussion, because we only submitted the article. I haven't figured out whether it was yesterday or the day before, but it was recently. And we had a bit of a discussion about what something further on might look like. And you have the roots. Okay, so getting people in the industry to say, oh, this is an interesting ladder. Does it speak to me? You know, can we that tool that we've developed? Does it make sense? So that's the roots, because we can't go any further without that. And then looking at the trunk, okay, so if it does make sense, or we have to modify it slightly, or whatever we need to do, we're not sort of tied to that as the way we go forward. What are the procedures? What are the mechanisms? What are the governance structures that we need to be looking at to take this forward? Business models, what aspects of the value chain do we need to change? That periphery core issue, the issue of purpose. So there's a whole lot of stuff there that becomes the trunk that we can explore with companies in the research sector. How can we move? How can we make this work? And then going to the top, we say, okay, we've distilled those things with the knowledge and the depth of experience of the resources sector. So now let's put together some design principles to say, okay, based on what we now know, these are the things that we can say to companies. What are you going to prioritise? What are you not going to prioritise? What does that look like? What are the critical decisions we need to make? All of those sorts of things will enable us to build a set of design principles that people can then develop into their own particular organisation. And it will hopefully transform the way that an organisation looks if you really do go right up to the top of that ladder and try and work through, you know, how that's going to work for each organisation. So that's me, and I think I've done not too badly with time. So yeah, it's over to you now, because these are really germinal ideas. And, you know, knowing exactly what that's going to look like, that's one idea. But, you know, really be looking for input on what you think of the ladder. Don't be too insulting if you can. And the way we could improve it and the way we can move forward with the research. So, yeah, over to you at this point.
Maybe I will open this floor for questions from the room here. Do you have any questions, comments you'd like to ask Caroline or the team? Anna?
Thank you, Caroline, for the very, very nice presentation, very complex ideas, which you nicely simplified for us. So thanks for that. I'd like to, if you could please tell us a little bit more, tell me a little bit more about what's the difference between the pillar 1 and pillar 2 and how they complement each other.
Okay.
If they do, or are they kind of separate?
Both.
Yeah, okay.
So when we were looking at Arnstein's model, to start off with, she had one pillar effectively, because she was looking at, okay, how do we give our citizens more power in these programs that were to do with racial minorities? And the government was basically saying, this is how we're going to implement it. We're going to do good for you. And then they realised that actually what they ended up with was not really that good, because it didn't come from them. And so it was all about engaging to deliver a better outcome. But it's not that simple with a business, because it's never that simple with government either, to be honest. But that's, you know, that's one of the major things that you're looking at in terms of whether you give people what they want. They've got to tell you what they want, and they've got to be part of the solution. In a business, though, you're looking at those things for sure, but you're also looking at the basic operational logics of business. And so the participation may not always be the thing that says that we're participating at this level, we've got robust two-way conversation. It doesn't always translate into the way that you're running your business. You know, you may not be reflecting that in the way that you operate. You may not be changing your technologies. You may not be complying with global standards. You know, there might be a whole lot of things that, yeah, you're saying you're going to do it, but you don't necessarily do it. So they're very interrelated. One does sometimes, or quite often, crossover with the other, but not always. And that's the reality of the business context, because you've also got those very torn apart accountabilities. You know, on the one hand, you're supposed to be doing this, operating optimally and effectively, and on the other, you want to listen to people. So that's why they have to be separate, but they also have to work together. Does that make sense?
Right. Thank you. I think so. Yes. Well, I understand this as being, and tell me if I'm wrong, that pillar 1 being kind of building like important elements that has to happen. Yeah. Is the what are the elements of the ladder, whereas the pillar 2 is how to operationalize that, the actions, but it's not that.
It's sort of that.
Yeah.
It's sort of that. So it's pillar 1 is more what Arnstein was talking about, power through participation. So that's the engagement part of the equation. Talking to people, allowing them to be part of conversations right up to their, you know, they're a big part of the way we're doing stuff, pillar 1. Pillar 2 is, aside from that, but often interrelated that, are we just scraping the bottom of the way we do things, just meeting human rights standards, just meeting basic environmental standards? Are we moving up the ladder? Best available technologies, that sort of thing. Are we building partnerships with other people and other organisations? So that's the operational aspect of it. So yeah, they go together sometimes, but often they don't. So is that okay?
Great, thank you. Maybe I can explain my different words.
Yes,
Pillar
please.
1 is more what you say you're committed to doing.
Yeah.
And then pillar 2 is actually how
How you do it.
how the operation,
Yeah.
how it's operationalized or not. And sometimes it may be aligned, sometimes it's not.
Yeah.
And the 2 pillar perspective helps us to see that alignment.
Yeah.
That's
I
very
know-
succinct. Thank you.
Janine, you have a question. Are you able to speak and ask your question, or would you like me to read your question? She says she's not able to talk right now. I'm assuming she can't. So the question is about trying to unpack the word genuine
Mhm.
engagement, which I guess the audience heard a number of times. It's about trying to help companies have a balance and genuine engagement across different stakeholders. So Caroline, would you be able to respond to that in terms of, can you give an example of what
Yeah,
genuine
sure.
engagement is?
Yeah, and I can also sort of try and use that to show how we think we're on one level of the ladder, but sometimes we're not. There was this discussion by Farrell, as one of the articles that we read amongst many, and he talked about the fact that they had to resettle a whole group of people and give them compensation. But anybody who knows PNG would know that the kinship ties, the way the clans work, the way that the land ownership works is just incredibly complex. And they did try to genuinely engage to work out, okay, who talked to who represented whom, all of those sorts of issues. So that was an attempt at genuine engagement. But it's also an example, at the end of the day, people got money and they didn't share it because the wrong people got the money, because they weren't representative of the kinship ties, all of that sort of thing. So it's a part of that iterative evaluation. You're trying to be right up there at that level, but as part of those outcomes and seeing what's actually happening, you realise that you're really not, that you haven't really engaged enough and understood enough to be that far up the ladder. So genuine engagement is there a lot. You see mining companies really trying to do the right thing. And in some cases, it really does create genuine benefits. In many cases, it does. But yeah, sometimes it doesn't, for a whole variety of reasons. So, yeah. So that would be one example.
Thank you. Janine, can you just indicate the thumbs up if you are happy with that response, or would you like to discuss it further? Okay, and move on to the next question. Adela, you had a question or a comment? You wanted
Yes,
to?
I heard thinking like an engineer and a business engineer. I heard 2 concepts. One was, this is what we need to do to be profitable, and this is our operations, this is our goal as a company. And the second one is, well, we need to take into consideration what community thinks as well, what people affected by our operations think, and acknowledge their impact on our operations and success. So first question is, are we looking only at mining industry? Because examples for mining. And the second question is, are there studies that actually indicate some proportion of that impact between the social pressure and NGOs and environmental and health concerns and the success of operations of mining industry? I think that's the area.
First question about the resources sector. That's where we chose to focus because it's so huge, the area, and also because it's so topical. And because of those first slides that I showed, the impact on communities all around the globe is so big. So that's the answer to that question, but it applies to so many businesses, yeah. And the second question was, how do you create that balance between
Are
the
the
two.
studies identifying that impact, describing it or quantifying it?
Yes, all the studies that we looked at were trying to do that. So many of the studies were critiques, and they're basically looking at, okay, this is happening on the ground. You know, what are the benefits that these people are receiving? And there were all sorts of quantitative measurements, there were interviews, there were all these sorts of studies that were looking at it to try and understand, you know, what needs and desires and of whom were being satisfied while they were remaining viable. So yeah, it's a complex area, and the measurement metrics are incredibly opaque. You know, there's no distinctive kind of say this is the gold standard of how you measure that, and that's one of the big issues. It's such a slippery sort of area. Yeah.
Diana?
Yeah, in the data, the last step was citizen control. What does that mean?
Yeah. So those latter descriptions are from Arnstein, the original model, which looked at when citizens who were the racial minorities in New York City were basically taking control of these programs. And they were making sure that they answered the needs of their people. And so we've used that label and then translated it using the literature to say what that would look like in the resources sector. So it's not a literal translation, it's just a translation of the character of that top rung. And so when you're looking at the literature, it's hard to find cases where companies have taken their CSR right up to that level, which in that environment of the resources sector, citizen control will probably be where a organisation really understands they've moved in, they're part of a community, they're part of, schools and education, and whether you're value adding or not, whether you're polluting or not, you know, who's really seeing it as a holistic sort of a community. So that's how you translate it into the sort of context we were talking about in the resources sector.
And second question, how this model goes beyond compliance?
I'm sorry?
How the data go beyond compliance?
Beyond compliance?
Yes. Safety.
Yeah.
Safety standards, CSR standards, really well described.
Yeah.
In industry. Yeah.
So compliance is kind of right down the bottom of the ladder, you know, So the fundamentals of supply and demand are at the bottom of the ladder, where you say, we're going to make a profit, you all get jobs, you all get a whole lot of stuff.
But they have to.
And then you move up the ladder. Well, a lot of the times they don't. There are so many mines in Ecuador, say, for instance, where different companies are operating and they don't comply with anything. The children are digging around in the mud, in closed-in mines where they can hardly breathe. So, right down the ladder is conflict, where there's suppression and violence. And then you go up the levels where, okay, they're accepting they have a responsibility. And so they're starting to comply, first of all, with local needs, then up the ladder to global standards, and then way beyond that, where you go way beyond compliance up to the top of that. Michael?
Yeah, I think so much, Caroline, was a great presentation, big topic, and big ideas. A follow-up question. We see this in many projects we have here between urgency and ambition. I look at the trust concerns, but I'm not looking at trust as an opportunity. I do what's needed, but I don't get an extra step. The economic lens, in the case you just described, is sort of affordability. In order to climb up that ladder, how does it correlate with affordability? And we see this with climate or whatever, where you look at developing countries and you look at first world countries, and of course they're at different positions in the ladder, but it's a question of economic affordability. So that's our economic lens. How does it blend into your work?
Well, it plays out in a couple of ways. The first one is that, Porter and Kramer, say, for instance, they created a framework which basically says that if we do this right, we'll make more money. If we've got a productive workforce, we've got a community who's behind us, if we've got supply chains that are really working for us, we will make more money. So that's that virtuous circle. And they basically say, why are we seeing it us and them? It's us and them together, but that's still a medium-term view. Whereas if you took a longer-term view, once again, you might take an instrumentalist perspective, or you might take a more moral perspective, but it doesn't mean you're being unaffordable, but it might mean that, say, your cash flow looks different during different periods of time. You might be, sacrificing a bit of profit, a bit of cash, a bit of liquidity at a certain point to get to an end point. So, and obviously you can't go beyond the viability constraints. That sort of almost goes without saying, because then you don't have an argument. So so it's sort of long-term, short-term kind of, yeah.
And if I may add to that, the current status of the framework is at a descriptive level. It describes different places an organization can be, and one of the things in the future tree is to unpack what's the impact and what are the mechanisms, and how do those impacts and mechanisms differently come to life in different contexts. We have to unpack that.
Yeah, that's really true. Yeah.
So the next steps. So this was conceptual, and it looks very complex when you look at all those factors like culture, regulations, etc. So in future, we want to narrow it down somehow, and then what kind of methodology do you want to apply? You want to create empirical data to identify those mechanisms, or what?
What do you think?
Well, it can go in various directions. I would probably narrow it down to some aspects because it's very complicated or very complex at that stage.
I have looked at it and looked at the reflection, the learning, strategy development, and there are so many elements in each one. And I think the only way that we can approach that really is by beginning to talk to people in the industry and finding out where those real pivot points are between doing one thing and another, and then starting to narrow it down in that sort of way. So really that's going to be evidence-based kind of process, I think. But going in and trying to narrow it down just ad hoc, given that it is such a complex area, there'd be a lot of kind of downfalls in taking that approach, I think. So I think we have to accept the complexity and work with it. Is that okay? As to actually how we design that at this point, I think that's going to be an iterative process as well.
Are there any questions from the online members who have joined us? Thank you, Anissa, for posing that. Thank you for those who have asked questions. Any further comments? Yes, Anna, thank you.
Can I have one more question?
Yes, please.
You provided a list of paradoxical tensions that might have occurred in that context. Say one of them, the long versus short-term tension. Could you give example of how you think the ladder can help addressing that tension?
Yeah, I think it does that by the very nature of it allows you to reflect on, we're doing this, we're in this part of the ladder, which is usually associated with tokenism, like a swimming pool, a piece of infrastructure. The ladder will really crystallize that for us and help us to understand, okay, we're at this point, or we think we're at this point, but actually, when you look at underneath, we're at this point, and then looking at, okay, so what do we need to do to move further up? And then the ladder provides some descriptive sort of outlines of what the character of those rungs further up in the ladder would look like, and how that would mean you'd have to change stuff.
I think it can also be used for decision making, like in the time, if there is a certain event or context in which the corporate has to make a decision can look at the ladder and get an idea, like point of reference to see in the short term, this is the immediate impact. In the longer term, this could be the impact. It can be used in that, potentially used in that way as well to plan out, what do we do now? What are the implications short term, long term?
Yeah, that's right. Sorry, I missed that bit of your question, short term, long term. And the top of the ladder is a long term view.
So, yes, please.
Sorry. So we talked about how empowerment and engagements can happen without translating into business actions.
Yeah.
So we know that like different stakeholders will have different interests, different concerns. So based on the ladder, like can businesses use the ladder to justify how they listen, how they respond to some of the stakeholders' interests, but not others' interests?
Yeah.
How they prioritize?
Yeah, well, that's exactly what it's for. So, they can look at, that y-axis, they can look at that in relation to each stakeholder group and say, okay, how are we responding to these, to this group, say, the greenies, and why are we doing this at this level when we could be doing it at this level, and try and understand that, and then work out, oh, well, it's because of jobs, and we're responding because we can get social license to operate because we're giving these people jobs. So gaining that insight into what trade-offs we're making, and then looking at, okay, but the synergies could mean that we're moving into renewables and there'll be even more jobs. So it's kind of working out, yeah, definitely, that's precisely what it's for.
This is very useful because the communication industry is very interested in finding out how to close the loop with the stakeholders that they engage with. And they often have to justify how come they didn't listen to some of the stakeholder groups.
Yeah, I saw that research. Yeah. Oh, great. Oh, that's good to know.
But this hasn't been published yet, right? So we can't.
Well,
okay.
and one thing that you can do with resources policy, and I don't know how this applies to being published or not, but you can put a preprint online. They put a preprint online for you. But Kevin, I'm not sure how that, can people start talking about this at this point in their own environments?
As long as it's share the paper.
I'm happy to share the paper. Would you like me to do that? Yeah, fantastic.
I won't share further without permission, but it's I might share with others.
I actually think it's fine at this point. Yeah.
As member of the newly joined member of the team, and we would love to hear your views in terms of how the ladder can be used in different contexts. So thank you. So are there any other comments or questions from the audience? Yes, please.
I think what has not probably come out in the conversation is the letter simply mapped out all the possibilities in the landscape with different time scales and different decision kind of metrics. But what is, at least my understanding of it, what is somewhat different with the way we're approaching it is that usually when you think about stakeholder engagement or CSR, there's the boundary of the organization, the stakeholders out there, outside the boundary of the organization. The idea of the letter as you move up and the idea of citizens control is you bring them into the decision-making process. So this stakeholder enfranchisement idea is to open up the boundary of decision-making. So in a purely kind of government sense, you give them the funding, they make the decision.
Yeah,
you don't interfere with the decision-making. So the citizens has control over how funding is used. Now that's easily doable in that public money space, but corporate is different. They got other stakeholders that they have to be accountable for. But I think an important element of this is to rethink about who you engage in making what decision. And it's just highlighting different ways to think about the possibilities. Then we can consider trade-offs and how affordable. With the new way of thinking about it, you find ways to make it affordable. But it is that engagement, because often your stakeholders are they're very understanding if they know why you made the decision. So this is about bringing them to the journey with you, so they can see the transparency in the decision-making process. things. I think that's an important
I
message.
think that's
that
great. I
comes
think
in the
that's a great
complexity.
message. Yeah. But with, you know, where you get to the top
Yeah,
numbers where
yeah.
you say you take the money,
Yeah.
with the corporation, our top part of the
Yeah.
ladder is where we say
Yeah.
we're all in this together.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
This to me looks a little bit like a maturity model,
Yes.
isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes, so
That is so not my language, but yeah.
Thank you very much. Our language, the language I come from, and I've flagged this to Kevin as well. It does look like a maturity model. And when we talk about mechanisms, really we're looking at what are the different competencies, capabilities organizations need at different levels, right? And when we have those competencies or capabilities, however you may call it, that will enable you to move to the next level. So I think in the longer term, in the program of work, either we call it a maturity model or not, when we are unpacking mechanisms and means to move forward, that's essentially what we're doing, a progression plan, a roadmap, and knowing what to focus on in each of those stages.
There's the but. There's always the but. But we're not saying it's linear in our sense. You can choose to be at different phase with different stakeholders, but this gives you the language to talk about it.
That's exactly.
So a maturity model is not also always linear. And you may make decisions, for example, you might also make decisions not to be in the optimal level because of the very resource constraints that Michael raised, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes a moderate level is enough for who you are, what you can do for that context, and so forth. So moving forward, being able to unpack it, I think it's an interesting agenda item to work on. So we are reaching the hour, and once again, I'd like to thank you, Caroline, for a really rich and detailed presentation. Again, working on a very complex topic. The team started earlier last year, and you've helped us to really crystallize and articulate the current thinking, which is still very high level.
Yes.
And we look forward to working with everyone, including new members in the audiences, to see what could be the next steps moving from here. So with that, I'd say thank you. Please join me again in thanking. Thank you everyone who took the time to be here face to face with
Thank
us.
you for coming.
And also for our online friends, thank you very much, and hope you have a lovely afternoon and the rest of the week. Thank you.
Thank you.
No,